I was born and raised on that farm. And to me, it wasn't just acres of soil and a patchwork of cornfields stretching into the horizon. It was my family's history carved into the earth. My father had worked these fields until his hands were thick with calluses. My grandfather before him had tilled the same ground with a mule-drawn plow. And even though I carried a title in Washington far grander than farmer, this land was the core of who I was. I was the United States Secretary of Transportation, and while my colleagues in the cabinet knew me as a man of policy, infrastructure, and federal oversight, back home, I was just the guy who fixed fences, pulled weeds, and kept the tractors running through long Midwest summers. No matter how many highways, bridges, or airports I was responsible for on a national scale, this farm was the one piece of ground where I still felt like the world couldn't touch me. Or so I thought, until the HOA came barging into my life, wielding arrogance, ignorance, and an unbelievable sense of entitlement that would eventually drive them to try and build a runway straight through my fields. The whole mess started innocently enough, with the arrival of a new housing development about 3 miles down the road. The developers had carved up good farmland into tidy, suburban lots, slapped cookie-cutter houses on top of them, and sold the dream of rural luxury to folks who wanted to brag about living in the countryside without having the slightest clue what it meant. Before long, the homeowners had formed their own association, an HOA, as is custom in such places. At first, I paid them no mind. What business did a cluster of suburbanites have with a working farm that had stood here for more than a century? But these weren't ordinary homeowners. These people had money, ambition, and the kind of reckless confidence that comes from believing you can bend the world to your will. They wanted more than just houses. They wanted prestige, convenience, and something flashy to put their little community on the map. And that's how, one fateful morning, I learned that the HOA had voted to construct a private runway for small planes. The catch? Their chosen site ran straight through the northern edge of my farm. The day I discovered this plan, I had been up since dawn repairing an irrigation line near the cornfield. My phone buzzed with a message from a local friend. "You see this nonsense in the county planner's office? Looks like they filed for a permit to run a strip through your land." At first, I thought he was joking. But when I drove into town later that afternoon and pulled the file myself, my jaw nearly hit the floor. There it was in black and white, a proposed layout of a 2,000-foot paved runway, complete with hangars, fuel storage, and a taxiway, drawn across a portion of my property like my ownership was a minor inconvenience. They hadn't called me. They hadn't asked. They hadn't even considered the fact that land use wasn't theirs to dictate. They just assumed that with enough pressure, with enough collective whining, they could shove me aside and get what they wanted. What they didn't know was that I wasn't just some farmer they could bully. I was the U.S. Secretary of Transportation, and if there was one man in this country who understood federal aviation regulations down to the letter, it was me. I didn't reveal that to them immediately, though. At first, I wanted to see how far they'd go, how brazen they'd become. Within a week, a delegation from the HOA showed up at my door. They pulled up in spotless SUVs, 3 men and 2 women dressed like they were attending a country club luncheon instead of visiting a working farm. Their leader, a tall man named Gregory Henson, introduced himself with the kind of handshake that tried too hard, firm to the point of arrogance, his smile too polished to be trusted. "We're here to talk about progress," he said, looking past me as though the fields were already paved over. Behind him, one of the women, someone I'd later learn was the HOA's treasurer, nodded with a grin that suggested she was about to sell me something I didn't need. They laid out their vision, a community runway that would increase property values, attract investors, and bring the area into the modern age. They spoke of airplanes as if they were the inevitable future, as though agriculture was some outdated relic that would soon be swept aside. When I asked them why they thought they could cut across my farm, Gregory waved his hand like it was a trivial detail. "The county will support us," he said confidently. "It's only a matter of time." I stood there, boots caked in mud, hands still sore from wrestling with irrigation pipe, and realized I was staring at a collection of people who genuinely believed the world bent to their signatures on a homeowner's contract. They had no respect for history, no understanding of law, and certainly no clue who they were dealing with. I listened politely because years in Washington had taught me patience, but inside I was seething. When they finally finished their pitch, I leaned against the porch railing and told them flatly, "This land isn't for sale, and it sure as hell isn't for lease." They exchanged glances like they couldn't comprehend anyone saying no to them. Gregory's smile faltered for just a second before he forced it back into place. "We'll see," he said as they left. "Progress has a way of moving forward whether people want it or not." That was his mistake. Threatening me on my own land, underestimating not just my stubbornness, but my position. They thought they were fighting a farmer. In reality, they had picked a fight with the very man who oversaw every runway, taxiway, and airstrip in the country. That night, I sat in my office overlooking the fields, lights dim, a legal pad on the desk where I began sketching out my counterattack. I knew the Federal Aviation Administration regulations like the back of my hand. No runway could be built without meeting safety standards, environmental impact assessments, and zoning approvals. Noise abatement, air traffic control coordination, and liability insurance were hurdles these people hadn't even dreamed of. And then there was the ultimate kicker, federal preemption. Aviation wasn't governed by some neighborhood association's whims. It was regulated by the United States government, and I was one of the people at the top of that chain. If the HOA wanted a war, they were about to learn they'd declared it on the wrong battlefield. The next few weeks became a chess game, and I had the advantage of knowing every rule on the board. The HOA thought they could bully me through county channels, sending petitions and filing paperwork as if bureaucracy was their personal bulldozer. But bureaucracy was my world. I had spent years buried in regulatory frameworks, congressional hearings, and the delicate dance of balancing state interests with federal oversight. Every time they filed something, I was waiting with a counter. When they requested zoning approval, I quietly called a contact in the county office and reminded him that FAA regulations preempt local land use for aviation purposes. When they tried to schedule a town hall, I made sure the agenda included a lengthy explanation of environmental impact assessments, complete with maps of migratory bird patterns that would grind their project to a halt. What they saw as roadblocks, I saw as checkmate after checkmate, each one delivered with a calm smile while they grew more frustrated. But the HOA wasn't used to losing. They were a collection of doctors, lawyers, and corporate executives, people who believed their money and influence could bulldoze through any obstacle. Gregory, their self-appointed visionary, kept showing up at county meetings in tailored suits, waving glossy renderings of their future runway, like a preacher with a Bible. He called it a symbol of progress, an investment in the future, and a gift to the community. His followers clapped politely, but the farmers, ranchers, and small-town locals in the audience weren't buying it. They knew what it meant to lose good land. They understood that a runway wasn't progress. It was noise, pollution, and danger in their backyards. At one particularly heated meeting, Gregory stood up and announced that the northern tracts of farmland, meaning my fields, were underutilized and could be better served in aviation development. I rose from my seat, all 6'2" of me, and let my voice cut through the crowd. "That northern tract feeds more people than your HOA ever will," I said. "And if you think you can pave over it, you'd better learn the federal code first." The room erupted in murmurs, some clapping, others glaring. Gregory turned crimson, his polished smile breaking into a scowl he couldn't hide. What the HOA didn't understand was that their arrogance was fueling something bigger than a land dispute. It was igniting a community battle. Neighbors who normally kept to themselves started showing up at my farm to offer support. Old farmers brought coffee and pie, sitting on my porch and telling me stories of when their families had faced similar threats from developers. Young folks, fresh out of AG school, volunteered to help me compile data on soil quality, crop yield, and environmental importance. Even local pilots, the very people the HOA thought they could win over, took my side once I explained the dangers of trying to run a strip without proper air traffic coordination. "It's a disaster waiting to happen," one retired Air Force colonel said. "Private jets buzzing over farmland with no tower? Somebody's going to get killed." The more the HOA pushed, the more resistance grew, until it felt less like me against them and more like the entire county standing up against outsiders who thought they could bulldoze tradition with dollar signs. Still, I wasn't naive. I knew the HOA would escalate, and they did. Within a month, I started receiving letters from their lawyers, threats of eminent domain, claims of easements, even accusations that my farm violated zoning codes. Each letter was thicker than the last, filled with legal jargon meant to intimidate. But every time, I responded with precision, citing chapter and verse from federal statutes they hadn't even considered. When they claimed eminent domain, I reminded them only governments, not HOAs, had that power, and even then only with just compensation and public necessity. When they claimed easements, I produced century-old deeds showing my family's continuous ownership. When they accused me of zoning violations, I walked into the county clerk's office with permits signed by the same officials who now sat shaking their heads at the HOA's audacity. It became a war of paper, each side stacking documents higher and higher. But my stack was built on law and history, while theirs was built on bluff and arrogance. Then came a day they tried to break me with spectacle. Gregory organized what he called the Future of Aviation Fair, right at the edge of my property. They rented tents, brought in model airplanes, and invited local media to watch as he gave a speech about the inevitability of their runway. They even went so far as to paint white lines in the grass, as if a landing strip already existed. Cameras clicked, drones buzzed overhead, and reporters scribbled notes while Gregory waved his arms and promised prosperity. I stood at my fence line, arms crossed, boots planted firmly in the soil that was mine, watching the charade unfold. When a reporter spotted me and asked for comment, I simply said, "This farm isn't going anywhere. Neither is their runway." My words ran in the next day's paper alongside a photo of me, silhouetted against the fields, and that image did more damage to the HOA than any legal brief could have. People didn't see a bureaucrat. They saw a farmer defending his land, a symbol of resistance against greed disguised as progress. But the HOA wasn't finished. They began whispering in political ears, trying to climb ladders they thought would bypass me. Gregory made trips to the state capitol, met with lobbyists, and even tried to curry favor with a congressman known for backing development projects. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that every one of those calls, every one of those meetings eventually circled back to me. I was, after all, the Secretary of Transportation. I had staff in every region, contacts in every state, and a seat at the table where real decisions were made. Their whispers were like sparks thrown against a storm wall. They fizzled before they even hit the ground. One senator, a longtime friend of mine, called me personally after meeting Gregory. "This guy has no idea who he's messing with," he laughed. "You want me to shut him down now, or let him dig his own grave?" I told him to wait. Sometimes the best way to win a war was to let your opponent spend every ounce of energy digging the hole they'd eventually bury themselves in. Of course, letting them dig didn't mean I was idle. Behind the scenes, I was building my own case. I assembled a binder thicker than a phone book, filled with everything from aerial maps to soil reports to detailed analyses of air traffic corridors. I had memos from the FAA outlining safety hazards, letters from environmental experts warning about endangered species in the wetlands near the proposed site, and testimonials from local pilots about near-miss risks. Every angle was covered, every potential weakness in their plan highlighted and cross-referenced. When the time came, I'd be ready to drop it all like a hammer. And in the meantime, I kept farming. Each morning I rose with the sun, tended the crops, fixed what needed fixing, and reminded myself that this land had survived droughts, floods, and storms far worse than any HOA could muster. They thought they were playing a game of power. To me, it was simply life, and I had no intention of losing it up by the middle of summer. The HOA's patience had worn thin, and their frustration started boiling over into reckless actions. At first, it was little things, survey stakes hammered into my north field without permission, drones buzzing low over my barns as if they were scouting the land, and strange vehicles parked along the road with people taking notes. I reported the trespassing to the sheriff, who knew me well enough to send deputies out, but every time the culprits melted away before anyone could catch them in the act. Gregory denied involvement, of course, but his smirk at the county meetings told me otherwise. They were testing me, probing for weaknesses, hoping I'd slip up or lose my temper. But I'd spent years in Washington, where patience was as much a weapon as power. Losing my cool would only give them the advantage. Instead, I documented everything. Each stake pulled up and tossed in my barn, each drone photographed and reported, each car license plate written down. I was building a record, a meticulous log that would one day be Exhibit A in a reckoning they didn't see coming. Then came the day I knew the battle had shifted from a nuisance to a full-on war. I was working the southern field when I heard the roar of an engine overhead, louder than the crop dusters that occasionally flew by. Looking up, I spotted a small Cessna making a low pass, dipping so close that its shadow rippled across the corn rows. My gut twisted. This wasn't a coincidence. Within minutes, the plane circled back and touched down, not on my land, but on a hastily mowed strip in a vacant lot owned by one of the HOA's allies. I drove up in my truck, dirt flying behind me, and found Gregory and his entourage cheering as the pilot taxied to a stop. "See?" Gregory shouted over the noise. "Proof of concept. This will work." They were trying to demonstrate that their dream runway wasn't just theoretical. But what they didn't realize was that staging an unauthorized landing was not only reckless, it was illegal. I pulled out my phone, snapped photos, and by sundown, I had already filed an incident report with the FAA. The next morning, federal inspectors were on site, notebooks in hand, measuring and questioning. Gregory's smug grin faded fast when the inspectors cited him for operating an unapproved airstrip. That was the first time I saw doubt creep into his eyes. Still, like any man too deep into his own delusion, Gregory doubled down instead of backing off. He started hosting private HOA meetings in their clubhouse, whipping his members into a frenzy with promises of wealth and prestige if only they stood firm. "This farm is holding us back," he told them. "We can't let one stubborn man stop progress." Some of them cheered, others hesitated, but he was persuasive enough to keep their money flowing. I knew because a friend inside the HOA slipped me recordings of those meetings. Hearing Gregory call me a roadblock to the future only hardened my resolve. He had no idea that every word he spoke was now evidence of his intent to circumvent federal law. And while he thought he was rallying troops, I was quietly expanding my network of allies. By this point, I wasn't just a farmer defending his land. I was a cabinet secretary preparing for a political storm. I had senators briefed, FAA lawyers drafting memos, and even the Secretary of Agriculture keeping a close eye on the situation. Gregory thought he was fighting a local skirmish. In reality, he had stepped onto a battlefield that stretched all the way to Washington. The pressure built week by week. The HOA filed a lawsuit in county court, claiming I was obstructing community development. I walked into the courtroom in my best suit, flanked by my legal counsel, and sat quietly while their attorney delivered a pompous speech about the greater good. When it was my turn, I didn't need theatrics. I simply laid out the facts: federal preemption of aviation law, safety hazards, environmental impacts, and my family's legal ownership. The judge listened carefully, and within minutes, it was clear the HOA's case was nothing more than smoke and mirrors. The lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice, meaning they couldn't refile it. Outside the courthouse, Gregory tried to save face by ranting to reporters, but the cameras caught the sweat on his brow and the cracks in his composure. Meanwhile, I walked past with a calm nod, to picture a man who knew the law was on his side. That evening, the local news ran a split-screen photo, Gregory red-faced and shouting, me walking to my truck with quiet confidence. The headline read, "Farm versus HOA. First round goes to the farmer." I won't lie, I clipped that article and pinned it on my wall. But battles like these aren't won in a single courtroom. The HOA regrouped, licking their wounds, and soon after they tried a new tactic: smear campaigns. Flyers appeared in mailboxes accusing me of being an obstructionist, claiming my farm was environmentally damaging and that I was hoarding land that could be better used. Social media pages popped up, run by anonymous accounts, spreading lies about pesticide use, tax evasion, and even animal cruelty. It was laughable. Anyone who knew me knew I took care of my land and my livestock like family. But lies have a way of seeping into the public mind, and I had to act fast. Instead of fighting fire with fire, I opened my farm. I hosted community days where families could walk the fields, see the crops, pet the animals, and eat fresh food from my land. Kids ran through the grass, parents shook my hand, and people left with bags of sweet corn and tomatoes. Local reporters came too, writing stories not about an obstructionist, but about a man preserving the heritage of farming against corporate greed. The smear campaign collapsed under the weight of truth, and the HOA found themselves mocked for their desperate lies. By late summer, the war had reached a stalemate. They hadn't built their runway, but they hadn't given up. I hadn't lost a single acre, but I knew the fight wasn't over. What kept me steady was the land itself. The way the corn shimmered in the breeze, the way the soil smelled rich after a rain, the way the horizon stretched out in golden rows at sunset. Every evening I'd walk the fields, boots crunching on gravel, heart steady with the knowledge that I was exactly where I belonged. And deep down, I knew this wasn't just about me. It was about every farmer who had ever faced the arrogance of outsiders who thought money could replace tradition. It was about proving that land, law, and legacy were stronger than entitlement. Gregory and his HOA thought they could pave over history. What they didn't realize was that they had awakened something far more powerful than their suburban dreams. They had awakened a man who knew both the dirt beneath his boots and the laws written in Washington. And I wasn't about to let either one be trampled. Autumn rolled in, and with it came the turning point of the war. Corn stalks brown in the fields, leaves scattered across the gravel roads, and the cool air carried with it a kind of tension, like the whole county was holding its breath. The HOA had gone quiet, too quiet, and I knew from experience in Washington that silence usually meant plotting. Sure enough, one evening as I was finishing repairs on a combine, I caught the glow of headlights creeping along the north boundary of my farm. I slipped into the shadows of the barn and watched as a group of men unloaded equipment, surveying tripods, measuring wheels, and even a small bulldozer on a trailer. They were preparing to break ground, permits be damned. My fists clenched at the sight, but instead of storming out in anger, I pulled out my phone and filmed everything. By dawn, that footage was already in the inbox of both the county sheriff and the FAA regional office. Within 48 hours, federal inspectors and deputies were standing shoulder to shoulder at the property line, confronting Gregory and his crew. The look on Gregory's face when the FAA slapped a cease and desist order into his hands was worth every sleepless night I had endured. He sputtered and shouted, but the law wasn't on his side, and for the first time, the HOA realized that their dream runway wasn't just stalling, it was collapsing. But men like Gregory don't go down without a spectacle. A week later, the HOA called an emergency community meeting and invited the press. I knew what it would be before I even arrived. Theater. They rented out the high school auditorium, filled it with banners about progress and prosperity, and packed the seats with every homeowner they could drag in. Gregory strutted onto the stage like a politician at a rally. Microphones lined up before him, cameras flashing. He launched into a tirade about how my farm was an obstacle to modernization, and how I was using government power to strangle community dreams. His words dripped with venom, painting me as a tyrant instead of a farmer. When he finally called my name, challenging me to answer in front of everyone, I stood slowly from the back row. My boots echoed on the polished floor as I walked down the aisle, and every eye in that room was on me. Taking the microphone, I spoke not with anger, but with clarity. "You talk about dreams," I said, locking eyes with Gregory, "but dreams don't override law. They don't override safety. And they sure as hell don't override the rights of a farmer whose family has worked this land longer than your subdivision has existed." The crowd murmured, some nodding, some scowling, but I could see the cracks forming in Gregory's support. He had fire, but I had facts. And people respect truth when spoken plainly. The battle should have ended there, but Gregory was too far gone. He poured every ounce of HOA funds into the fight, hiring high-priced consultants and even flying in so-called aviation experts to bolster his case. They hosted glossy presentations with PowerPoints showing economic growth, graphs of projected property values, and computer-generated images of jets gliding gracefully over the cornfields. But behind the smoke and mirrors, their plan was rotten. I dismantled each presentation piece by piece, showing that their economic data was pulled from cities, not rural counties, that their graphs ignored environmental costs, that their glossy images didn't account for flight paths crossing over schools and neighborhoods. With each rebuttal, more locals shifted to my side. They weren't farmers, but they understood common sense when they heard it. And when one of the so-called experts admitted under questioning that they hadn't even coordinated with the FAA before making their projections, the room erupted in laughter. The HOA had turned their crusade into a comedy show, and I made sure every failure was documented for the record. Meanwhile, I kept farming. Harvest season waits for no man, and while Gregory wasted time on speeches and consultants, I was in the fields from dawn to dusk. There was something grounding about it. Driving the combine through rows of golden corn, hearing the steady thrum of machinery, feeling the weight of history in every bushel collected. Neighbors came to help, families brought food, and kids rode along in the tractors with wide eyes. The farm became more than land. It became a symbol of resilience. Local papers ran features on the secretary farmer, painting me as a man straddling two worlds, one foot in Washington, the other firmly planted in soil. I didn't ask for the attention, but I knew it mattered. Public perception was a weapon in this war, and with every story, every photograph of me in dusty overalls beside gleaming machinery, Gregory's narrative crumbled further. He wanted to portray me as a bureaucrat wielding power. Instead, I was the farmer defending his legacy, and America has always had a soft spot for farmers who stand their ground. But the HOA wasn't finished. Desperation makes men reckless, and Gregory's next move was his most dangerous yet. Late one night, I woke to the sound of engines outside. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped onto the porch and froze. Several vehicles had pulled in the edge of my north field, headlights glaring, engines idling. Figures jumped out, Men with shovels, stakes, and spray paint cans. They were trying to mark out a runway under the cover of darkness, hoping to get far enough along that undoing their work would be a nightmare. My blood boiled, but instead of charging into the night, I dialed the sheriff. Within minutes, squad cars rolled in, lights flashing, sirens cutting through the still air. Deputies arrested half a dozen men for trespassing and vandalism. Gregory wasn't there, of course. He was too smart to dirty his own hands, but his fingerprints were all over it. The next morning, the county paper ran the headline, "Runway Raiders Arrested on Secretary's Farm." The HOA's credibility, already fragile, took a devastating blow. Homeowners who had once cheered Gregory now demanded answers. Some even began calling for his resignation. For the first time, I sensed the tide turning permanently in my favor. Still, I wasn't content with a stalemate. I wanted closure, not just for me, but for every farmer who'd ever faced the arrogance of outsiders. So I prepared my final strike. I requested a formal federal hearing, leveraging my position to bring in not just local officials, but state and federal regulators. In a packed courthouse, I laid out everything. The illegal landings, the trespassing, the false economic claims, the environmental hazards. I presented photographs, documents, sworn testimonies, and even the secret recordings from inside HOA meetings. The evidence was overwhelming. By the time I finished, the panel of officials looked less like judges and more like executioners waiting to deliver a verdict. Gregory tried one last fiery speech about innovation and progress, but his voice cracked, his words fell flat, and the room knew the fight was over. The ruling was swift. The proposed runway was permanently denied. The HOA was fined for unauthorized construction attempts, and all future aviation projects in the county would require state and federal pre-approval. It was a victory so complete that Gregory's shoulders slumped as though the weight of his entire delusion had finally crushed him. When I walked out of that courthouse, the autumn sun warm on my face, I felt something deeper than triumph. It wasn't just that I had won, it was that the land had won. The farm stood untouched, the fields unscarred, and the air free of the noise and danger they had tried to impose. Neighbors clapped me on the back, reporters shouted questions, but I simply tipped my hat and drove home. That night, as the harvest moon rose over the cornfields, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and breathed in the quiet. Gregory and his HOA had thrown everything they had at me: money, lawyers, lies, and even midnight raids, and still the farm endured. Because in the end, land isn't just dirt. It's history, family, and the backbone of a nation. And no amount of arrogance or ambition could ever take that away. Winter came, and with it a calm that felt almost foreign after months of chaos. Snow dusted the rooftops and blanketed the fields, quieting the land in a way that only the Midwest can. For the first time in a long while, I could walk the farm without scanning the horizon for survey stakes or listening for the whine of drones. The war was over, the runway denied, and the HOA's dream reduced to ashes. Gregory resigned not long after the ruling, though he tried to spin it as a strategic retreat. In truth, his reputation was in tatters. Homeowners whispered about how he had wasted their money, dragged them through legal battles, and nearly bankrupted their association. Some sued him personally. Others simply packed up and moved away, their dream community soured by the scandal. I didn't celebrate his fall, though I won't lie. It was satisfying to see arrogance collapse under the weight of reality. For me, victory wasn't about humiliating Gregory. It was about protecting the soil under my boots, the same soil my father and grandfather had bled into, and ensuring that no one could ever again mistake this farm for a blank canvas to be paved over. Still, the fight had changed me. Before all this, I had thought of myself in two halves: the farmer at home and the Secretary of Transportation in Washington. The two lives rarely overlapped. But the HOA's war against my land had forced those halves together, showing me that the skills I used to navigate national policy were the same ones I needed to defend a cornfield. Law, patience, strategy, and conviction. They weren't separate tools for separate worlds. They were the same set of weapons, whether I was testifying before Congress or standing at a county meeting with mud on my boots. That realization gave me a deeper sense of purpose than I'd ever had in politics. It wasn't just about drafting regulations or overseeing infrastructure anymore. It was about ensuring that progress never trampled over the people who feed this nation. The HOA had taught me a lesson they never intended, that sometimes the fiercest battles aren't fought in the halls of power, but in the quiet fields where history lives. In the months that followed, I became something of a symbol, though not by choice. Newspapers across the country picked up the story of the secretary who saved his farm. Editorials praised me as a defender of rural America, a man who proved that laws still protected ordinary citizens against greed. Invitations poured in, speaking engagements at universities, interviews with major networks, even a request to write a book. I turned down most of them, preferring the rhythm of chores and the peace of winter evenings by the fire. But I did agree to one televised interview, standing in the barn with cattle behind me, explaining that land isn't just property, it's responsibility. That clip went viral, surprising even me. Letters arrived from farmers in states I'd never set foot in, thanking me for standing my ground. A rancher in Texas wrote, "You fought for all of us." A wheat grower in Kansas sent me a handcar plaque that read, "This land feeds the nation." Those words hit me harder than any applause in Washington ever had. By spring, the farm was alive again. The snow melted, the soil thawed, and the cycle of planting began anew. Tractors rolled through the fields, seeds dropped into rows, and the land hummed with the promise of another harvest. Life, as it always does, moved forward. Yet the memory of the battle lingered in the background. Every time I saw the fence line where survey stakes once stood, every time I glanced at the patch of grass where the trespassers had been arrested, every time I read the clipping of that first headline still pinned to my wall. Those scars weren't ugly. They were reminders. Reminders that no matter how powerful or arrogant the opposition, this land could not be bought or bullied. It belonged to those who loved it, worked it, and respected it. And as long as I drew breath, it would remain exactly that. I knew the HOA, or something like it, would rise again someday. Maybe not here, maybe not in my lifetime, but somewhere another group of men in suits would look at farmland and see nothing but potential. That thought didn't scare me anymore. If anything, it strengthened my resolve. Because the truth is, progress and tradition aren't enemies. Real progress is building new highways without destroying old fields. Real progress is expanding airports without trampling over history. Real progress is remembering that infrastructure serves people, not the other way around. I had lived that truth both in Washington and here on the farm, and I knew now that my mission was bigger than either role alone. I wasn't just the Secretary of Transportation, and I wasn't just a farmer. I was both, and that balance gave me the strength to defend what mattered most. On the final night before planting season, I walked the farm under a sky blazing with stars. The air was crisp, the ground firm beneath my boots, and the silence deep enough to hear the hum of life waiting to awaken in the soil. I paused at the north field, the very ground the HOA had once tried to claim, and knelt down to scoop a handful of earth. It crumbled between my fingers, rich and dark, smelling of life. In that moment, I thought of my grandfather with his mule-drawn plow, my father with his calloused hands, and the generations yet to come. This wasn't just dirt. It was legacy, and thanks to the battle I had fought and won, it would endure. As I stood, I whispered into the night, not for anyone to hear, but for the land itself. They thought they could pave you over. They were wrong. You're still here, and so am I. The runway was never built. The HOA faded into history. But the farm lived on, unchanged, unbroken, eternal. And as long as I breathed, it always would.